A forest always seems to be a magical place, a place of wonder and delight, where adventures can happen. Maybe it's the way the light shines through the leaves, soft shadow patches flitting across the ground. Maybe it's the way the tree trunks rise to dizzying heights. Maybe it's the rustle of mice sneaking from tiny ponds and making their nests in grassy holes. Maybe it's just because we all have stories set in forests. But what are forests really like? Why do they exist? What kind of fauna and flora do you find in them? What do forests mean for your people and your magic in a fantasy world? Today, let's take a general look at forests in a fantasy world. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds. If you like this kind of video and you want to support me, there are links to my Ko-fi down below where you can do one-off donations or become a monthly member, or you can buy my books available on Amazon.com, also in the link down below. Okay, let's get cracking. So a forest is a very complex ecological system where trees are your dominant life form. And it's very specific here, trees must be your dominant life form. They're one of the most efficient ecosystems in the world with an extremely high rate of photosynthesis. Forests develop when the temperature rises above 10 degrees Celsius, that's 50 degrees Fahrenheit, in the warmest months, and the area gets more rain than 200 millimeters or 8 inches per annum. So that's a very broad part, and that is why forests cover so much of Earth's biome. But there are obviously very different forests depending on which region of the planet you're on. So, what different types of forests are there? Taiga or boreal forests are snow forests where you get mostly coniferous trees. So that's trees with needles instead of leaves, not generally broad-leafed trees. Also not generally trees that lose their leaves in winter, also called deciduous trees. Temperate forests have got a more or less continuous canopy of broad leaves, and they occur approximately between 25 and 50 degrees latitudes in both hemispheres. Tropical forests have got a closed canopy and grow within 20 degrees north and south of the equator. The temperature of tropical forests vary between 20 and 35 degrees Celsius. So you'll notice there that I spoke about canopy. Canopy is very important in a forest context. Forests exist vertically as well as horizontally in terms of differences in their biome. And the canopy is one of the most important things in how the forest lives. This canopy is formed by the leaves of the trees on their crowns as they close out the rest of the forest. Why is this canopy so important? So the first reason the canopy is so important is because of light interception. And this is determined by the number of layers in the canopy. The thicker your canopy, the more light it will intercept. The upper layers of your forest, closer to the crown, get more light, of course. The denser your canopy, the less light filters through to the forest floor. If you've got very little light filtering through to the forest floor, you actually get animals that are adapted to low light conditions that live on the forest floor. This is also why you don't get much grass or herbs in old forests, because the canopy reduces the light coming through so much that there is not enough for those kinds of plants to live in the forest environment. It's also why you get fungi so often in forests. The low light conditions suits their growing period very well. Canopy also provides a great deal of climate control. Basically, the worst parts of the climate, the heavy rains, strong winds and so on, all get caught up in the top part of the canopy, and it keeps the lower part, the closer to the forest floor, much more temperate in its climate zone. And this is what allows ungulates and other such animals to live very comfortably in the forest, even if there's a lot of continuous rain that comes down onto the leaves of the canopy top. The canopy also provides fertilization and the character of the soil in terms of the leaves that fall down onto the forest floor. That's why, for example, boreal forests have got such acidic content in their soil floor, because the pine needles that fall down are quite acidic in their content level. And of course, the deciduous leaves that drop their leaves every year provide a very rich fertilization for everything else that lives in the forest. They basically mulch the soil of the forest, providing rich soil for herbaceous flowering plants to grow in. Forest canopies also play an important part in rainfall. So the forest canopy actually holds a lot of the water that the tree absorbs, and it recirculates it back into the atmosphere through a process known as transpiration. It is estimated that roughly 1/3 of the rainfall in the Amazon forest is due to the forest canopy. So the forest canopy is really quite central to your forest, and you should bear that in mind when you're designing a forest in your fantasy world. Broad leaves that don't vanish annually will create a dense, shadowy environment in which creatures adapted to low light conditions will live, whereas broad leaves that are lost annually has a slightly different effect, as we'll see when we come to the specifics of temperate forests. But there's another differentiation factor with forests as well, and that is the age of the forest. So a forest grows through growth stages. All forests basically start with an open field. So there's an open field, and then there are hardy pioneer species that basically move into this open field. And by move in, I don't mean they deliberately choose to move in. I mean, they're carried there, and because they are such hardy species, they sprout in the field and they grow into trees and shrubs and so on. Now, bear in mind that everything that I spoke about the canopy, does not exist in an open field. It is not a temperate environment. There is no protection from the elements. You get direct sunlight on you all the time. And that's why these pioneer species need to be such a hardy species. So once the pioneer species have established themselves and they've started creating temperate zones around them, then you start getting the second growth of the forest, because now they're creating partial protection for the other plants to grow around them. And then you get bigger trees that start moving in, that kind of grow under the protection of this pioneer species. And eventually you get a stable, established forest, also known as an old growth or old forest. Okay, so that's a very broad idea of what a forest is and the kind of growth stages they go through. If you enjoyed that overview of forests, hit the thumbs up button. Okay, let's talk about taiga or boreal forests. So these are the forests that grow in my backyard, right here in Finland. They are generally coniferous forests, which is to say cone-bearing needled leaves or scaled leaves evergreen trees. These are trees like spruces and pines and larches and so on. There are some deciduous trees like the birch and the poplar. Finland's national tree is actually the silver birch tree, so we definitely do have some deciduous trees. But the dominant tree type is the coniferous tree. These needles of the coniferous tree are a specific adaptation to being cold, as is not losing their leaves. Putting out new leaves every year requires energy, and when your summer growing season is as short as it is up here in the north, it makes sense to conserve your energy and not waste it in growing new leaves every year. And that brings us to the climate type of taiga forests. Taiga forests typically grow in regions where the winter is long and very cold, with short days and a persistent snowpack. This is a photo of my garden during winter. And I live in the southern part of Finland. We have a snowpack of roughly a meter all winter long, no problem. Now, besides the trees, there are obviously other plants that grow in forests. So what other plants grow in the shade of coniferous trees? Predominantly, your secondary flora in taiga forests are shrubs, mosses, and some carnivorous plants. The reason for this is because the needles that fall from the trees make the soil very acidic, as I said, and that limits the plant life to those plants that can adapt to the acidic soil. Now, shrub types include things like the blueberry shrub, and blueberry picking is quite a pastime here in Finland during the summer months, and an activity we often participate in. There's also the lingonberry shrub that grows here in our forests, and lingonberries are of course made famous by IKEA for the sauce you put on your meatballs, but lingonberry sauce is also fantastic on reindeer. If you ever get your hands on reindeer, goes well with lingonberry sauce. Anyway, speaking of carnivorous things, the sundew plant also grows in the taiga forests. And the reason why the carnivorous plant works in the taiga peat bogs is because it can get the nutrients it needs from eating insects rather than being dependent on the very acidic soil. So there are some plants that grow in the coniferous forests, but the real champion of the taiga forests are your mosses, your fungi, and your lichens. So the peat moss is the primary component of peat, hence the name. It produces even more acid to go with the acidic needles, and that actually prevents bacteria from entering the peat bogs. And that is the reason why the plant materials in peat bogs decompose so very, very slowly. It's because bacteria can't live in this highly acidic environment created by the peat moss and the pine needles in conjunction, which has some interesting implications for your magic system in terms of a magic system based around preservation and slowing things down. I could see such a thing growing up around peat bogs, where you use peat bogs as a component to slow things down. And if you're slowing things down, I can see that having an impact on you maybe going into necromancy, which might explain why there are so many bog monsters and bog hags that come out of the peat bogs, and why it's typically a thing associated with necromancy. It might very well be because of this kind of preservation effect of the bacterialess water of peat bogs. And I thought that was a very interesting take on this moss. Now, there's another thing which is called a moss, but it's actually a lichen, which is reindeer moss. Now, first, a lichen is not a plant. It is a symbiotic mix between an algae and a fungi. Reindeer moss, this lichen, covers the ground of the taiga forests and even grows on the tundra up further north where you don't get trees anymore. It's a very, very important food source for reindeer and moose and so on. And then, of course, fungi are an absolute champion of the taiga forests, as they are of most forests. And I did a whole video on fungi, which you can check out after you've seen this one in the card of this video. So those are the other plants that share the forests with the taiga forest. But what about the animals of the taiga forest? So obviously winter is a huge problem, and most of the animals that live in the taiga forests are adapted to it and are mammals for that reason. Mammals are most well adapted to living in this kind of cold environment with their thick fur and blubber layers and so on. Often these animals do change their fur season to season, so the Arctic hare, for example, will in the winter get a white coat to blend in better with the snow, and then in summer it will change its coat back to being kind of brown to blend in better with the summer grasses. These animals also quite often have very, very big feet, comparative to their size so that they can walk better on the snow. An example of this is the lynx, which actually has quite giant murder mittens for its given size. Birds also live in the Arctic forests. However, many birds do migrate. They only come back in summer when insect life is plentiful, because insects predominantly die off, obviously, in winter. In summer, let me tell you, we have insects. The mosquitoes up here hunt in packs in summer. So there's plenty to eat all summer long. And then the warblers and finches and so on, they all migrate for the winter. Some birds don't migrate, like the owls. And owls actually have a very interesting thing where they will steal other birds' nests during the winter. So before those migratory birds return home, the owls will find a nest they like and just move in. And then, good luck to the bird whose nest that was last year in evicting the squatter. Of course, humans also live up here, though not many of us. And that's because logging and timber is a great resource. In fact, it is estimated that around 95% of Finland's productive forest types have been harvested at least once. Now, I will say that there is nothing wrong with harvesting your forests as long as you make sure that you kind of keep replacing them. You don't over-harvest, because what happens then is you stop having forest and you go back to open fields. And as we spoke about in the growth of forests, that means you need the hardy species to reestablish themselves, and you lose all of the biodiversity that a forest offers. But this is fantasy. So what does a taiga forest offer you as a fantasy world builder? Obviously, cold magic will be a thing up here. And I did speak about that during my video of extreme cold environments. Winter magic will be a thing. Monsters that use winter magic will be a thing. We also have a deep love for horror stories and kind of crime stories up here. Our TV is full of these TV shows where, like, the village is, 100 people and a dude gets murdered and the detective needs to solve the crime and so on. It's very funny. We have a complete obsession with murder up here. So think about kind of horror mystery style of monsters. Also, you're probably looking at a kind of shamanistic magic, a magic of people who live close to the land and spirits who are part of the land who are entreated to look after and protect the people. And if you enjoyed that discussion of taiga forest, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about temperate or deciduous forests. So these are trees that do lose their leaves in the winter, and they're generally oaks, elms, birches, maples, beeches, and aspens. They have broad leaves and they form this continuous canopy. Generally, these forests form in temperate climates that do have a winter season and have year-round precipitation. Because the canopy goes away in winter, you actually have quite strange behavior among the flora that share the forest with the trees. So in the early spring, before the canopy is fully formed again, the forest will have herbs and other flowering plants that grows there because there's enough light filtering through the new growth of the forest leaves. But in summer, once the canopy is fully established, those plants die due to the lack of light. So it's a very interesting cycle that exists in these forests because of the leaves going away and then reforming again. Speaking of plants that grow in such a forest, there's a plant called foxglove that is used to treat heart failure, but it is super poisonous. And that kind of plant, to me, speaks of a shamanistic component-based magic where you have, the medicinal values of foxglove, but at the same time, its hyper-dangerous qualities if prepared incorrectly or taken in too large a quantity. It's worth thinking about plants like that and what impact they would have on the culture of your people and the medical technology of your culture. And by medical technology, I don't mean our modern medical technology. I mean their use of medicinal plants available to them in their environment. These forests are very rich in life. You have a lot of reptiles and insects here. You have snakes. You've got these awesome little fire salamanders that you can see, they like this bright yellow patterning. But when they're actually born underwater, and they've got these amazing crested gills that stand out like this, that they breathe through when they're young. It's just so cute. They are, of course, poisonous, so don't touch their skin. Don't try and eat them. It won't end well for you. But they look very cool. You also get raccoons in forests. You get spiders. No comment. Spider monsters are very common in fantasy. You'll never see it in my world. I am very arachnophobic and I hate spiders. Moving on. There is also something you find in the forests of Germany, which is just the cutest, most adorable thing you've ever seen, which is a wild cat. And it's cute and adorable because it looks exactly like a house cat, except it's wild. So they're just adorable. Of course, humans often make their home inside of these forests. It is a rich environment in which to find food. You have building material right on hand in the shape of the trees themselves. You have a lot of water, you have a lot of flowing water, and flowing water can drive flour mills and it can drive the hammer mills of a smithy. So, as we spoke about previously in tidal videos and so on, water is a thing that can provide you with power, both for magic, if you want to go that way, or for normal industry through the use of the kinetic energy of the water flowing over a wheel. So because of this and because of the climate, forests make ideal settling environments for humans. And I would imagine that, like with our world, many of your cultures would have settled in a temperate forest. In terms of magic of a temperate forest, this is the place where druids shine. So all of the druidic lore and so on that you can find out of Europe, it all comes into play here. Gathering moss with a golden sickle under the silver moon, building special circles in which you perform rituals, entreating the spirits of the forests, being the lore speakers, all of that lore becomes valuable in temperate forests. There's also an element of temperate forests which I haven't seen used in fantasy world, but which occurs to me could be very interesting to play with, and that is that falling leaves could become a component of sacrifice magic. I mean, the trees basically cut these leaves off and let them die in order to put out new growth. And it might be interesting to build a magical system where those falling leaves represent the trees sacrificing energy, which can be used by the magic users to power their spells through the trees giving up this life energy. It was just an interesting thought to play with in terms of a life sacrificial magic system. Of course, these kinds of forests are also ideal for things like fairies and the kind of monsters that come out of the fairy monstrous realm. So elves and gnomes and all of these things live in this type of forest. Everything which finds quiet, shady holes where it retreats into is a thing that can find a home in a forest. And if you enjoyed that discussion of temperate forests, hit the thumbs up button and let's talk about tropical forests. Just before I get to tropical forests, I just briefly want to dive down a rabbit hole called Elfin Woodlands. Elfin Woodlands is the coolest name for a thing that I've ever heard of. And what an elfin woodland actually is a stunted forest that grows at high elevations in tropical wet areas or temperate coastal areas. It is short, gnarled trees heavily draped with air plants, and its floor is cushioned by mosses and ferns. These forests are typically not very biodiverse. There's only a limited number of woody species and vertebrate animals compared to the surrounding forests at lower elevations. But they are super cool. They're not common, obviously, but they're super cool. So consider creating some elfin forests somewhere in your world. And maybe you can even have some real elves in there. Okay, back to tropical forests. Tropical forests are formed of broad-leaved trees that form a very, very dense upper canopy. Now, it doesn't always rain all year round. In Australia, for example, there is a dry season when there isn't as much rain and there is a tropical rainforest there. But I'm going to focus here on the typical tropical rainforest, which does get rain all year round. Now, I do want to say that we have catalogued the barest inch of tropical forest animals and plants. So we're still discovering new species. These forests are some of the richest, densest environments in the world. But here are the things that we do know about tropical rainforests. Flowering plants, especially flowering trees, are extremely common. There's an area of 23 hectares in Malaysia where 375 different tree species grow in just those 23 hectares. Tropical rainforests are therefore seldom dominated by a specific type of tree. Air plants are super common and can be found attached to the stems and sometimes even the leaves of larger plants. So they kind of like hang from other plants. Ferns, mosses, lichen and algae are very common, as is liverwort. Liverwort, by the way, is a small, non-vascular, spore-producing plant, and there's over 9,000 species of them. I didn't even know about this word until I actually started researching tropical forests. So there's a new species for you to use in your world if you also didn't know what liverworts were. And of course, tropical rainforests have fungi, so many fungi. Okay, so much for the flora of tropical rainforests. What about fauna? Well, spiders. Of course there are spiders, which is why I won't visit tropical rainforests. Have you seen the size of the spiders? Anyway, moving on to the rest of the animals. This is a ridiculously rich biome. I could spend a couple of videos literally just naming species that we found. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to skim over the animals that I find most fascinating about tropical rainforests. First, there is the blue morpho butterfly that actually lives in the canopy. And it has brown eye spots on its underside that trick predators into thinking that the butterfly is a bigger predator than they are, which I just find super cool, especially with like its very, very blue covering wings. Then there's the okapi that lives in Central Africa. This thing is so weird. I mean, look at that picture. It's the closest relative to the giraffe, and you have to love that face. Then there's the brown-throated tree sloth. So it can take up to a month to digest a single meal, and it moves so slowly that its fur takes on a green tinge from the algae growing on it. Then there's the capybara, which is the world's biggest rodent, and it can hold its breath for up to 5 minutes, which is just flat out amazing. And then there's the poison dart frog, which has got an extremely venomous skin, and in fact it is used to create poison darts with, hence the name, by the indigenous people of the forests where it lives. And of course one has to mention the green anaconda, which is the biggest snake in the world, clocking in at a massive 10 meters or 30 feet. Now, of course, humans do live in the tropical forests, but it tends to be more towards the edges rather than, say, in the center of the forest, because the center of the forests are fairly extreme environments. So much like your northern taiga forests, you're not going to get as many people willing to live, with the snakes and the spiders and the everything else that you find in the center of a tropical rainforest, especially with that thick canopy. So think about your people living on the edges of this tropical rainforest and expeditioning into the forest for the resources that they need, and then coming out with those resources to live in their village, which is more outside of the forest. In terms of magic of a tropical forest, really this is where I see component magic playing a deep, deep role. Because you have such an extremely rich biome, I can see this kind of environment being a component major's paradise. You could get, a poison dart skin as well as certain types of moss, as well as certain types of air plants, maybe some of those butterflies from the canopy. And all of that gathering of components then becomes a part of your magic system, and you then use those components to fuel your spells, combining them in new and different ways. I also think that this kind of tropical environment is a fantastic one for building extremely strange creatures that live in the depths of the forest and are rarely glimpsed and often only a matter of rumor. And the reason why it works so well for that is because it is hard to get into the forest, and when you are there, the chances of getting lost, turned around, or just plain not finding what you're looking for is extremely high. We thought the okapi was a myth. We thought it was extinct for years and years and years, but it still lived in the depths of the tropical rainforest in Central Africa. So you can go to town with your mysterious creatures in your tropical rainforests, and definitely worth thinking about component magic in such an environment. And that was the last of the forest types. If you liked this video, hit the thumbs up button and maybe check out my video on extreme cold conditions or my video on fungi. And if you want to connect around this or other topics, remember I do have a Discord server, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.